Today we're in Binsted, St Mary's Church in Binsted, West Sussex. It's a very small church. You might think it's terribly ordinary. You could walk past it and ignore it. In fact, it is remarkably special. There are a number of very particular things about this which make it actually extremely important. So much so that very recently English Heritage raised its status from grade 2 to 2-star. When the Victorians were restoring churches, they wanted them to be medieval, but they wanted their creature comforts too. The Victorians weren't stupid. And one of the key things that they regularly had to deal with was damp. Medieval buildings were damp, no damp courses and so on. So to put a drain around the wall with guttering and downpipes was an absolutely standard feature. Now what everybody did was to put the drain round the wall at the bottom. Here, however, the drain runs through little tunnels through the buttresses around the chancel. They are unique to the architect who did this, Thomas Graham Jackson. Nobody else ever did this in the 19th century. If you ever come across a little tunnel like this, you know Jackson worked on the church. The survey of the building before the restoration was started showed that parts of the walls were in not great condition. They had to be repaired, little sections. But when they came to the west end of the church, things were so bad they actually had to take everything down and rebuild the wall completely. And the physical evidence of that is very, very visible here. Here's the existing building. The flints are rough, they have not been tidied up, they're not necessarily even in straight lines. But here, once you follow this line and it goes all the way around the west end, these are completely different. They're made in neat rows, they have been roughly squared, and they have been napped to show a beautiful flint face. This is two things. This is showing a difference, this has been altered. And secondly, why? Because this is following the teachings of the great Victorian art critic John Ruskin. Work had to be honest, it had to be truthful. And what the architect Jackson is doing here is showing that he's altered things so that the history of the building can be read by looking at it. Jackson describes his childhood as steeped in Ruskin, and Ruskin influenced a whole generation of people, Jackson included. As we saw at the west end of the church, parts of the structure needed repair, even rebuilding. This is the east end of the church, and up in the apex of the wall there are two dates, 1868 up at the top, and then SB 1707. 1868 is the date when the restoration started. What's interesting is SB 1707. Between the Reformation and the Victorian period, an enormous amount of work was done to keep churches operating. They were old buildings, they needed constant repair. Seeing evidence of this is incredibly difficult because the Victorians destroyed almost all of it. But here they've left us a little clue. SB 1707 stands for Stuart Bindley, the rector from 1707 to 1725. The chancel was always the rector's responsibility. That stone tells us that in the early 18th century some serious repair work was done on the church. The physical evidence of that has been destroyed by the Victorians, but they've left us that little clue of the date stone from that work 150 or so years before. So as we've seen, the outside has got some very distinctive, important features that help to tell the story of the building. We need to go inside now, because inside the goodies are even better. When you go into a church, you probably walk straight through, don't even notice the door. Can I suggest you give them a second look. And this door really rather illustrates why. It's classic high Victorian, all this metalwork, this iron, two great straps holding the wood together. The high Victorians did this, nobody else did it. Notice the design is actually different. Architects like Jackson saw themselves as artists. They designed everything bespoke for each commission, and this is part of the proof that this is a purpose bespoke design creation, and they'd been made by one of the smiths from the contracting company. But notice two other things. Outside, we looked at the little drains that run through the buttresses, a Jackson signature. This door has got two others. The first is this handle, a strap bar. Not unique to him, but in his first 20 or so years on churches, he always used that rather than a ring turn. But what is unique to Jackson for churches in this period is a rebate. Now, a rebate keeps drafts out. You would think it was a standard thing to do, but look at the doors of all the great Victorian architects and they didn't do it. But Jackson did. Look at the roof. Look carefully. Jackson had hoped to be able to repair the old roof. Whether it was medieval or later, we don't know. Once they set to work, they discovered the rot was so bad they actually had to put on a completely new roof. Reports of the time say that he was copying the one he just replaced. Look at the restoration accounts, however, and it actually shows he's adding in all sorts of extra woodwork. He's made it considerably more complex, its structure, its construction, and it is quite exceptional. It looks like the roof of a barn. It doesn't look like a church at all. It's a mixture of tie beams, the horizontals, big chunky tie beams. In the middle of that is a vertical post coming up, the king post, and then there are a series of diagonal struts that lock everything together. It's unusually complicated. It does not look like a medieval church roof. It's again Jackson who's trying to move away from this high Victorian Gothic. It's what the scholars talk about the relaxing of Gothic, which they date to the 1870s. Here Jackson is doing it at the end of the 1860s. And it is vernacular, it is secular, it's domestic, it's not a church roof. And in a country parish, to have your roof which looks like a barn is actually really rather a good idea. Like we saw with the door, Jackson was one of these art architects, as they call themselves, who designed everything themselves. Like we saw with the West End, he was a disciple of Ruskin and wanted to show the honesty and truthfulness of construction. These benches show both of those together. The bench ends have got three very visible tenons. Now, you might think, God, that's really clumsy work. No, no, no. This is very deliberate. This is showing honest construction, how they are actually made. This is Ruskin put into practice. Jackson, the architect, artist who designs every little detail himself, these benches show that beautifully. They are really well made. These panelled backs with chamfered, every single edge, the rails, the muntins, they are all chamfered, made by the contractors' carpenters to Jackson's designs. This is not bog standard work you could buy from a church equipment catalogue. These are hand-designed, handmade, and really superior quality. The nave is fairly dark. The new windows that Jackson put in, he was replacing post-medieval, well, we're not quite sure exactly what date, but they're described as being sash windows, so they might even be early 19th century. He's putting in medieval style windows. But what's interesting here is what he does with the glazing. This is clear glass to maximise the light for the congregation. That's practical sense. But look what he's doing with the lead work. These thin lead strips called cames. These diamond panes, or sometimes they were set square on or rectangular. That's how Victorians did clear glass like this. It's very unimaginative, it's incredibly repetitive, and you see it everywhere. They all did it. But look at the top bits. These lead shapes, the cames, he's twisted them into some sort of, is it floral probably design, and up in the top, in that quatrefoil, he's bending them round. He's creating an artistic design with the lead cames. Now that's unusual. By the 1880s, 1890s, quite a few people were doing this, both in churches and in private houses. But to do this in the 1860s, well, I've yet to come across another architect who's doing this that early. This is Jackson the artist, and from the beginning of his career, he's starting to put these artistic touches into whatever he's creating. Binsted has a tiny fragment of medieval wall painting. It's all that's left of a very large cycle that may have covered the whole church, certainly most of it. They found it during the restoration, they uncovered it, and we know they uncovered it very carefully. But for whatever reason, the paint deteriorated rapidly, and most of it has gone completely, and this very sad fragment is all that's left. It's puzzled scholars as to what is going on in this scene. No one is terribly sure. They're not even certain who the figure is. It's female. There was a bit of text that is recorded, so we know it's a St. Margaret, but is it Margaret of Antioch, Margaret of Scotland? And what this strange sort of tree is, it's a big mystery. The sad thing is that this is all that's left. Because if it's right that there really was this great cycle of paintings covering even just most of the walls, that would have made this church very, very famous. As in the Middle Ages, for the Victorians, the east window was the most important of all. And the Victorians loved, indeed they largely reinvented stained glass. So a stained glass window in the East End is important, and it is significant because of the significance that they attached to it. Jackson, being the artist that he was, would design these things himself. Jackson went to his favoured company to make it for him, Pole from Whitefriars in London. The windows are composite. It's actually two designs at work here. There's Jackson himself, who did the grisé, that's the grey bits, the floral tops and bottoms. And then there are two pictures in the middle. They're by somebody completely different. One of the great Victorian stained glass designers, Henry Holliday. He didn't work for Poles either. He was a freelancer. And they were already in Pole's stock. Jackson took them out of stock and reused them. He changed various arrangements. He changed some of the colours. They're not his windows. They were actually designed in 1864, so 4 or 5 years before this restoration. There are two things that are particularly noteworthy about those holiday pictures. The picture on the right, the Good Shepherd, on the right-hand side, there are two sunflowers. Now, you won't find sunflowers in medieval windows, medieval art. The sunflower is one of the great Victorian motifs. It's associated with the arts and crafts movement. It's associated with the aesthetic movement, Oscar Wilde and so on. But that's in the 1870s, the 1880s. This is the 1860s. And we know from the records of Pole, the firm, that they were designed in 1864. That makes these two sunflowers 10 years earlier than what is meant to be the first, what is said to be the first appearance of the sunflower in Victorian art anywhere. The picture on the right, the feeding of the 5,000, a crowd of people. They're often quite difficult to tell exactly, are they male or female, but two figures are most definitely female. There's the figure with her back to us at the bottom, and then in the crowd up towards the top, just to the right of Jesus' head, is a very clearly female head, fair hair parted down the middle. Scholars talk now about the feminisation of Victorian religion. They're referring to the use of art and decoration, flowers. When this church was restored in 1868, to have put flowers here would have been incredibly controversial. But the point about feminisation of art, is Holiday playing a little game with this? Is he hinting at this? The lady with her back to us at the bottom of the picture in the middle, she is the most prominent figure in the whole crowd. To make the most prominent figure in the whole crowd female is making some kind of point. Even more, she is the figure who is being given a piece of the bread, the feeding of the 5,000. She is being singled out. Any woman parishioner from the parish of Binsted in the 1860s, 70s and so on, who noticed this, and you can't really miss it, she must have smiled and thought, oh yeah, this is a nice welcoming touch. The Victorians put down tile floors in their churches, absolutely standard. This one is so atypical. It's nothing like almost every Victorian church floor that you can see. And it's unlike those floors for several key reasons. The first is because it's made of glass. Yep, that's what I said. It's made of glass. It was made by one of the great glassmakers companies of the 19th century, James Powell and Co., Whitefriars in London. Jackson designed it. It was the first of a series of pavements that he would design for churches and other buildings for the rest of his long career. Not only is it made of glass, which makes it almost, well, certainly a great rarity, is the style that it is playing with. It's not an imitation, this is Jackson's interpretation of, but it's nothing like what the High Victorians did. They looked to North European medieval Gothic. There is none of that in this floor. This is Italian, this is Byzantine. This central panel here, this is from Byzantium and the Byzantine Empire of the 5th, 6th, 7th centuries AD. It's modelled on something called a pluteo, which was a stone screen around an altar. These curly, twisting, interlocking circles that go all the way around it. This is Italian of the 12th century. It's called cosmati work, after a family of stonemasons who specialised in it, the cosmati. Lots of the medieval churches of Italy have got these. You'll see a lot in Rome. And then there are these sort of strange shapes that look a bit like wiggles, and, well, it's very hard to describe exactly what shape they are. Where's he got these from? These he's got from the Venetian Empire. St. Mark's, Venice, the churches of the Venetian lagoon of the 12th, 13th centuries. This is southern medieval, not northern medieval. So it's not Northern European Gothic. It doesn't really actually look Gothic at all. It's not clay tile, it's made of glass. It's made by one of the greatest manufacturers of the 19th century. This is incredibly special. It is incredibly important. In my personal opinion, it's the most important, significant, valuable thing in the whole church.